The HR scandal that sparked a corporate reckoning and changed the workplace forever. I still remember the day she walked into our office. A sharp suit, a confident smile, and a resume that made her sound like she'd been sculpted in some corporate dream factory. "This is Claire, our new HR director," my boss said, like he'd just introduced us to the person who would fix everything wrong in the company. She shook my hand with a grip that was just a little too firm, like she wanted to establish dominance from the start. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I had my own projects, my own deadlines. But Claire had a way of inserting herself into every conversation, every meeting, even ones that had nothing to do with her. And she was good, too good, at charming the right people. Within a month, she was having lunch with executives, making jokes with the CEO like they were old friends. Still, something about her didn't sit right with me. She asked strange, probing questions about my team, especially about David, my business partner and closest friend at the company. We'd built our department from the ground up, and I could tell she was sizing him up like a predator watching prey. Then it happened. David was called into a meeting with Claire and the CEO. When he came out, his face was pale. "They're letting me go," he said, his voice low, almost stunned. The official reason? Restructuring. The real reason? I had no idea. But I saw the smirk on Claire's face when she passed my desk afterward. In the weeks that followed, 2 more key people were restructured out of their jobs. People who had been with the company for years, loyal, hardworking, respected. The atmosphere shifted. We weren't a team anymore. We were survivors waiting for the next axe to fall. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. You don't get your most experienced people without a plan, unless the plan is to replace them with people who owe you everything. And Claire, she looked like a woman who was just getting started. When David told me he'd been fired, I felt like someone had unplugged the lights in the middle of a play. One moment the stage was set, the next we were all fumbling in the dark. He didn't storm out. He sat at his desk, hands trembling, and let the news land like a physical thing between us. "They said it's restructuring," he repeated, as if saying the words might make them less final. He looked at me the way a man looks when he realizes a trusted map was wrong. Betrayed, disoriented, afraid. I remember the knot in my stomach, a mixture of guilt and impotent rage. David and I had bled for the company. We'd argued until our voices were hoarse, celebrated little victories with cheap takeout, covered for each other when one of us slipped. To see him dismissed on a phrase that felt like a euphemism was unbearable. I wanted to scream at Claire, to demand proof, to drag her into the hallway and make her explain what she'd done. Instead, I sat, listened to the hum of monitors, and told David I'd help him however I could. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, Claire's measured voice, the CEO's nods, the blank looks of the HR rep who read from a prepared script. I replayed the week before, too. The lunches, the way Claire had asked about our project timelines, the offhand comment about bringing in fresh perspectives. Fresh for whom? For her cronies? For people who owed her something? The next morning, I pulled up Claire's LinkedIn profile and CV. Small things you poke at when you're trying to make sense of chaos. At first glance, it was immaculate, but fingerprints hide in details. I noticed awkward gaps. A year listed at a boutique firm that suddenly disappeared off the map. 2 reference names that led to dead phone numbers. A recommendation from someone with no digital presence beyond a single, gingerly worded paragraph. It was the kind of thing you'd shrug off a networking event, but it sat wrong with me. I started talking to people who'd been let go. Not in a formal way, in whispered coffee shop confessions, in texts that came at 2 a.m. There was a pattern. Everyone said the same thing in different words. They'd been called into a meeting, given the same scripted rationale, handed a severance packet like you hand a returned library book. One person admitted they'd been interviewed by Claire months earlier and couldn't shake the feeling that something in the hiring process had been staged. Anger turned to a careful curiosity. If Claire had engineered this, there would be traces, emails, hiring paperwork, background checks, signatures. I knew corporate processes. I knew where people tried to cover their tracks and where they left them. I told David I'd start looking for paperwork. Not to be an avenger, he said, but because he needed to know the truth. I told him I'd find it. I didn't know then that finding it would change everything. I told myself I was just being thorough. That was the lie I repeated to quiet the hiss of guilt that crawled under my skin every time I thought about David pushed out the door. Just paperwork, I would say, and that would be enough to make my hand stop shaking when I opened the share drive. Late nights became my refuge. Not because the work required it, but because the office felt safer when most people were gone. The hum of the HVAC, the dim glow of monitors, the faint smell of coffee and disinfectant. Those small comforts steadied me while I followed the breadcrumb trail Claire had left, either by accident or arrogance. If you want to find a lie in corporate life, start with small things. A typo in a reference, an inconsistent timestamp, a doc saved under the wrong author. I dug into hiring packets, background check reports, and a messy heap of HR folders that, by design, are supposed to be boring. Boring is where truth hides. Boring is where people get sloppy. And she had been sloppy. Or bold. Or both. There were recommendation letters with identical phrasing but different letterheads, scanned at different resolutions. One background check returned no criminal history, except the contractor's notes said the search hadn't actually gone through because the vendor subscription had lapsed. A reference listed a company that had folded 5 years before Claire claimed she worked there. Worse, an internal email chain showed Claire personally pushing for expedited hires, copying only a handful of executives, and attaching resumes with metadata that didn't match the dates she'd given interviews. I felt sick reading her name beside phrases like urgent replacement and strategic culture shift. She'd been moving fast and quietly, carving out space to place people who would do as she asked. Every step smelled faintly of performance, rehearsed, polished, and fundamentally hollow. I should have stayed outside HR systems. I knew that. But when the truth sits like a stone in your throat, not looking is its own kind of complicity. So I reached out to Jeremy from IT. Not because he owed me anything, but because he owed the company honesty, and because he and I had once covered for each other during an impossible product launch. He came in with a coffee and a tired laugh, then sat down and watched as I showed him the files. He didn't need convincing. Metadata doesn't lie, he said, and his fingers moved over the keyboard like he wanted to play a piano. I watched him pull audit logs, pull timestamps, and quietly pull me deeper into a mess I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. The more we found, the more the picture hardened. Claire had not just falsified a resume. She had manufactured a narrative that got her access and leverage. As Jeremy exported the logs, I thought of David's face the day he left. Hollow, small, like someone who'd been emptied of future. I thought of the other people who'd been shoved out by the same polished argument. If what we held could stand up in court, it could end a career. If it couldn't, it could cost us everything. When Jeremy closed his laptop, he looked at me and said, "You know this will get messy, right?" I nodded. I did. There was no turning back. The files were only the beginning. I kept telling myself this was professional curiosity, a man chasing answers. But when I started calling the people Claire had pushed out, the words in my throat tasted like something else. Obligation. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the memory of David standing in the doorway, hands empty. Whatever it was, I couldn't let the silence win. We met in small, neutral places, a diner that hadn't changed its vinyl booths since the 80s, a coffee shop that smelled like cinnamon, and the sort of quiet that makes people confess. At first it was awkward. People don't like to say the words fired and scammed out loud next to a latte. But when the first woman slid an envelope across the table and said, "They gave me this and told me it was final," the room stopped feeling clinical and began to feel like a wound you could touch. Her name was Marta. She'd run payroll before Claire arrived. She'd been there 10 years and loved the small rituals of the place. Friday snack boxes, the way the sales team joked about their terrible predictions. She had proof, a corrected offer letter that matched none of the scanned copies in HR, a text from a manager with instructions that didn't match the official explanation. Her hands trembled when she talked, not from fear but from the relief of being believed. One by one they came. Ben from product, who'd been escorted out after 20 years for a vague performance issue. Rena from legal, who'd been told her role was redundant even as the company outsourced her work. And Marcus, who once took a mortgage refinance call in the middle of an onboarding session so his voice would let me know he wasn't inventing hardship. They all had the same aftertaste. Humiliation flavored with confusion. We started comparing notes. Patterns emerged like constellations. The same phrases and separation letters. The same timeline compressed into a few chaotic weeks. The same names of people who suddenly appeared in HR's emails like seeds dropped into soil. Someone mentioned a severance agreement that required silence. Someone else produced a photograph of a hiring event Claire had posted, with names in the caption that didn't match who'd actually been there. We agreed we needed counsel. That felt like the adult thing to do. Put a legal shield between us and whatever blowback might come. Marcus had a cousin who did employment law. She agreed to look at our packet in exchange for coffee and a firm handshake. She read the evidence and didn't look up from her notes until the end. "There's a case here," she said, slow and deliberate. "But you have to be careful. Collective suits change things, and so does publicity. Hearing a professional say the words collective suit made everything more real. It also made everything scarier. I thought about my job, the projects I was leading, the kids of friends who depended on our stability. I thought about David, who'd been quiet the whole time, watching us assemble armor out of other people's injuries. We weren't just a band of wronged employees now. We were a committee, a makeshift family welded together by outrage and proof. We drafted a list of demands, reinstatements where possible, compensation, and independent audit of hiring practices. But beneath the lists and the lawyer's advice, there was a quieter promise. We would not let this lie stand without a fight. The morning we filed the notice was colder than it should have been for late spring, as if the weather itself understood what we were doing and wanted to remind us this wasn't a picnic. I drove to the courthouse with a folder that felt heavier than it had any right to be. Printed emails, scanned recommendation letters, Jeremy's export files, Marta's envelope. David rode with me for the first time since he left, quiet and oddly steady, like a man who had finally given his grief a shape. Our lawyer, Angela, moved with a deliberate calm that felt almost contagious. She explained that the notice was just the beginning, a formal tremor that would rattle the company, and, if the press got wind, maybe more. We're not suing out of spite, she said, eyes on each of us. We're suing because there's a pattern of deception. That's illegal, and it's harmful. The words were plain, but inside them was the iron of ceremony. This was how adults did justice. Not with banners, but with filings, not with shouts, but with signatures. We expected denials. We expected HR platitudes and an internal memo about realignment. What we hadn't expected was the immediate, almost panicked, response from the higher-ups. Within hours, there were quiet meetings, hushed phone calls, and a new set of faces hovering around the CEO's office. I could feel the office shifting under our feet, the familiar rhythm of everyday work interrupted by the static of uncertainty. Claire's reaction was a study in composure. She posted a confident update on the company's internal feed, something polished and corporate about our commitment to excellence and respectful transitions. But between the lines, I could read the worry. She started scheduling one-on-one meetings with newer hires, the kind of meet and greets that are really check-ins. I wondered if she was trying to shore up loyalty or patch a leak. For all her charm, panic has a way of making people clumsy. The press caught a whisper of the story by the end of the week. An industry blog ran a short piece about unusual turnover at our company. It wasn't front page yet, but the ripple began. Investors started calling the CEO's office with questions that made their voices tight. When shareholders asked questions, things moved faster than polite boardrooms like to admit. That's when the company did something odd. It offered us mediation. The offer smelled like a shortcut, a way to control the narrative and keep things quiet. Angela advised caution. Accept only on paper and with a public record. We took her advice and turned down the private hush. Silence would have been the luxury of the guilty. We weren't buying it. At night, when the office emptied and the lights went low, I felt both exhilarated and exhausted. This wasn't what I imagined my career would be. Not a courtroom drama, not a crusade. I kept thinking of David's hollow look the day he left and the slow, soft way Marta's hand shook when she showed me the envelope. Justice felt bureaucratic and glacial in the daylight, but in the small, private hours it felt like something urgent and alive. We had made the first move. The company had noticed. Now the long work began, to turn papers and whisper into facts and accountability. Once the initial shock softened into a bruise, the real fight began. The whisper that had been an industry blog became a chorus. Investors called. One of the minor shareholders, the kind who keeps an eye on governance, sent an email asking for an independent audit of our HR practices. That email felt like a match struck in dry grass. I remember reading it at my kitchen table, the same place I'd opened bills and birthday cards 100 times, and feeling the oddest combination of relief and dread. Relief because someone with power had put the next step into motion. Dread because now our name, our grievances, were out where people could attach narratives to them. The board held a special session within days. I wasn't invited, of course, but the corridors hummed like a hive. Through a friend in investor relations, I learned they'd agreed, begrudgingly, to bring in an external firm to review hiring and termination decisions for the past 2 years. It wasn't a full confession, but it was the hinge we'd been pushing for. Claire didn't go quietly. Her allies, a loose constellation of executives she'd charmed, began to mobilize. I started seeing subtle campaigns to discredit us. Anonymous emails leaking selective personnel files, an internal memo questioning our motives, and a quiet rumor that David had performance issues predating Claire. The tactic was obvious. Muddy the water so the truth drowns in noise. It stung in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just protection of a job, it was character assassination of people who'd given their lives to this company. My phone filled with messages from friends and colleagues. Some offered support, others advised to lay low. My sister called more than once, her voice small on the other end, asking if I'd thought about my own future, if I'd considered how this might affect my mortgage, my reputation. Every practical worry was a stone I carried alongside the anger. This was not some cinematic crusade. It meant sleepless nights, legal uncertainty, and the possibility of losing the work that paid for my life. But then something quieter happened that steadied me. A mid-level board member, someone who'd always struck me as pragmatic, reached out through mutual contact and asked to meet. He didn't offer platitudes. He listened. He asked informed questions about the documents, about timelines, about why we'd waited to act. When I left that meeting, I felt for the first time that we weren't just a noisy group of former employees. We were a credible force with evidence and purpose. The audit firm announced their engagement 2 weeks later. I remember standing in my window watching rain streak the glass, thinking how oddly ordinary the city looked while everything in my life tilted. We'd forced an inspection into the company's marrow. Claire and her backers were circling, but now so were the auditors, people who would follow paper trails and timestamps with clinical patients. That kind of scrutiny can unravel the neatest fabric of lies. I went to bed that night exhausted, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without the tremor of panic. In the morning, the real work would start again. Testimony, interviews, press inquiries. The stakes had grown, yes, but so had the promise of accountability. The days after the audit began felt like standing at the center of a storm and watching the clouds form in slow motion. People I'd smiled at in the elevator now avoided my gaze. HR's inbox lit up with terse legalese. The company's counsel sent a letter to Angela's firm, the kind of document that smells of expensive stationery and menace. Threats of defamation suits, reminders of confidentiality clauses, hints about the disruptive consequences of going public. I read it in my kitchen and felt the old, familiar cold of fear, the kind that makes your mouth dry and your hands small. But the fear had a companion now, resolve. We had built our case on paper and timestamps. The truth was brittle and would shatter if struck properly. Angela advised caution, as always, don't talk to the press, don't post on social, let the audit do its work. For while we try to follow that path, sticking to the script of depositions and document requests. But Claire's allies were not waiting. They leaked selective memos to a trade reporter, painted us as disgruntled ex-employees, and floated the phrase revenge suit like a talisman meant to discredit us before the facts spoke. Then the first interviews began. Sitting across from an auditor felt oddly like confession. The questions were pointed, clinical, and somehow kinder than the whispers outside. I told the story the way the documents did, dates, attachments, metadata, but I also felt the urge to tell the human parts. The way David's laugh used to fill the bullpen, the way Marta would hide her worry behind joke, the way people packed up framed photos like folding little lives into boxes. The auditors listened. They asked for copies. They did not ask whether we were acting out of spite. Outside the audit room, the company doubled down. They offered severance packages with non-disclosure addenda to a few of the plaintiffs, the kind of offer that shimmers like a quick fix. Some took them, not because they wanted to be silent, but because the bills on their kitchen counters didn't ask for principled stands. I didn't judge them. I understood the algebra of fear and need. But I also understood the calculus of exposure. If the narrative could be controlled through quiet payouts, the structural route would stay hidden. That's when I made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff and landing on my feet. I reached out to the mid-level board member who'd listened to me earlier and asked if he would talk to a reporter we trusted. He hesitated. The language of corporate caution was in his bones, but when I pushed the folder of clean, verifiable documents across his desk, his face changed. "This will go public," he said, not as a threat, but as a promise. That night, a detailed article appeared online. It didn't scream. It didn't need to. It laid out names, dates, and the suspicious patterns we'd uncovered. The reaction was immediate. Comment threads spun up, investors asked for emergency meetings, and the CEO's calendar filled with calls. Claire's camp retaliated with PR statements and legal threats, but the tide had started to turn. I lay awake after the article, the hum of distant highway like the pulse of a city suddenly awake. The crossfire had begun, and for the first time in weeks, I felt both terrified and strangely alive. The week the shareholders started whispering felt like a slow-motion freight train. Small voices became louder. An investor conference call here, a pointed email from a pension fund there, and suddenly the boardroom stopped being insulated. I watched from a distance as the company's polite scaffolding creaked under pressure. People I barely knew were suddenly on our side. Not because they loved us, but because they feared the shape of a scandal more than the consequences of admitting a problem. Paul, the board member who'd listened to me in that quiet conference room, became an unlikely ally. He moved with the kind of careful bluntness that makes executives uneasy. He asked difficult questions in public sessions. He insisted that the audit firm be given full access, and, most courageously, he leaked no more than necessary. "We do this right," he told me once, "or we do more harm than good." His caution steadied me. Claire went on the offensive. She held tight-lipped meetings with legal and PR, posted glossy messages about commitment to our people, and leaned heavily on a narrative we all knew too well. Change is hard. Turnover is normal. There's no single villain. Her allies rallied quietly in corners of the building, their eyes sharp as if measuring how much damage they could absorb. It felt like watching a chess game where one player was bluffing with a pile of gold coins. Then the auditors delivered their preliminary report, a document that felt at once vindicating and terrifying when Paul slid a copy across my hands. There were phrases like material inconsistencies, a pattern of misrepresentation, and questions about authorization. The language in formal reports is dull and precise on purpose, but when you read between the lines, it roars. They found enough to recommend a deeper investigation and to suggest immediate administrative actions while they continued their work. The board reaction was swift and surgical. Claire was suspended pending the investigation. Her office door, once a place where her laugh echoed, had a placard on it like something out of a hospital ward. Temporary leave. I won't pretend I felt nothing. There was a small, fierce joy that warmed me, but joy in victory is never clean. It was tempered by the knowledge that suspensions can be tactical, that those who build a network of favors don't always fall when the scaffolding comes down. Her allies lost influence overnight. Their calendars thinned. Their invitations stopped arriving. The CEO convened an emergency session and pledged cooperation with the auditors. Investors demanded assurances. The company announced a temporary leadership reshuffle, promising transparency while we heal and rebuild. Language, again, doing the heavy lifting. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the folder of prints and logs feeling like a relic. David called and said the word I'd been waiting to hear without admitting it. Relief. But he sounded brittle. He'd been collateral in a war of paperwork and power, and victory didn't soothe the months he'd lost. I understood then that justice was uneven. It repairs some things and reveals others still broken. Outside, the city moved like it always does. Inside, changes happened in quiet corridors and louder memos. We'd won a crucial round, but the war wasn't over. The auditors were still sifting through years of decisions, contracts, and emails. The next chapter, I knew, would be about consequences, legal, financial, and human. I wasn't sure if I wanted what that would cost. But like a stone set in motion, we'd gone too far to stop now. When the board called the emergency meeting that led to Claire's formal dismissal, I felt the floor drop out from under me, and then, strangely, rise into something steadier. The word they used was precise and clinical. Terminated for cause. It landed like a hammer, and a hush fell over the newsroom of the office. I remember my throat going dry as someone read the list of findings aloud. Falsified references, unauthorized hiring shortcuts, interference with termination procedures. It was all there, in black and white, the kind of proof that doesn't argue with sentiment. Claire left with a small box, smiling with the brittle grace of someone who knows how to perform dignity. Her supporters scattered, some taking severance in silent retreats, others trying to explain away their roles as mere administrative error. A handful of her closest allies pressed for settlements in non-disclosure terms. Others resigned quietly and fast. The power they once had evaporated like breath on a cold window. But the company wasn't satisfied with a single name on a termination memo. The auditors recommended regulatory complaints be filed, and an internal task force was set up to examine whether there had been broader governance failures. That meant potential fines, an overhaul of hiring practices, and the uncomfortable possibility that board members who'd looked the other way might face consequences of their own. It felt like watching a tree finally fall after years of termites. We'd struck at the trunk, and now the roots were exposed. There was jubilation in small corners. David got a meeting about reinstatement and a compensation offer that acknowledged years lost. Marta was offered a consulting role to rebuild payroll integrity. Jeremy got a promotion in IT for the forensic work he'd done. But not everyone was invited back. Some wounds were deeper, careers rerouted, reputations tarnished even among those vindicated by truth. I realized victory didn't automatically mean restoration. I was offered a seat on a new oversight committee, an odd honor that came with a suitcase of obligations. Part of me wanted to accept simply to make sure we didn't let the company slide back into its old patterns. Part of me wanted to walk away entirely, to let someone else clean up the mess and reclaim whatever piece I could. In the end, I said yes. Not because I crave power, but because I'd watched what silence does to ordinary people. At night, I still dreamt of the early days, of cheap takeout and late laughs and the small, human routines that made the place feel like a home. Those things hadn't all returned. The bullpen was quieter. New hires filtered in like careful seeds. I missed the ease of not thinking about contracts and audits and the tiny betrayals that add up over time. But I also felt a steadying satisfaction, a sense that we'd done something that mattered beyond our paychecks. When I think back, there's a stubborn, simple truth. The cost of exposing a lie is never only the lie itself. It's the work to rebuild trust afterward, the phone calls to customers, the awkward apologies to friends who lost their footing. It's also the small, private relief of watching something rotten be taken out of the garden. We had paid for that relief in coffee stains, late nights, and brittle conversations with people we once liked. I kept a scrap of Claire's final, pristine termination letter folded in my desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that truth, once found, asked to be tended. When the dust finally settled, the office felt both unfamiliar and honest. The bullpen had the same fluorescent hum, the same crooked whiteboard with half-erased strategies, but it no longer smelled like fear. People moved differently, careful, yes, but with a steadier step. There was a new rhythm to conversations. Cautious candor instead of the practiced politeness that used to paper over problems. I walked those aisles and felt like a stranger who'd come home to find the furniture rearranged, but the house still standing. We had won a public victory, but victory had its own ledger. The board brought in new leadership, people with reputations for cleaning up and, more importantly, with an appetite for rebuilding trust. They instituted transparent hiring panels, third-party background checks, and a clear appeals process for terminated employees. It felt bureaucratic and beautiful in equal measure. Processes that might seem dull to some were the scaffold on which honest workplaces were rebuilt. The company published a remediation plan, and for the first time in years, I read corporate language that actually matched action. Claire's supporters slipped away in silence or with small protests, their calendars thinning and influence evaporating like fog. Some left industries altogether. Others attempted reinvention, but found doors closed in ways that resembled consequences, not coincidences. There was no gloating. Seeing them lose their leverage was not a pleasure, so much as a confirmation that systems have teeth when people insist they should. What we'd done was not about revenge. It was about removing a rot that could have spread. The personal cost lingered. David took a long pause before returning to work. The company offered him a thoughtful package and an apology that read like something written by someone trying very hard to be sincere. Marty took on a consulting role to fix payroll, and, late one afternoon, we sat in the break room, eating the stale cookies they always ordered for meetings and talked like colleagues who'd been through a storm. Some people never came back, and their absence was a hollow you learn to live with. I accepted a seat on the oversight committee, convinced by the belief that someone needed to keep asking the awkward questions. It wasn't heroic. It was ordinary vigilance. Minute audits, quarterly reports, the occasional tense conversation with executives who still preferred comfort over disruption. I learned to hold both gratitude and skepticism in my hands at once. The work of rebuilding trust is slow, and it requires you to be present when others would rather walk away. At night, I still sometimes dream about that first meeting when David left. Mostly those dreams have softened. They are tinged now with the strange warmth of survival. I've also found small joys again. Weekend breakfast, a movie that made me laugh, the quiet of a book read on the porch. The fight changed who I was, sharper in some ways, softer in others. I understand now that accountability is not a single act, but a long habit. When I look back at the pile of files that started this whole thing, I don't see a weapon. I see evidence that people matter more than processes when those processes are used to hide harm. We didn't just remove a bad actor. We nudged a system toward behaving like the people it was meant to serve. That is imperfect, and it is everything. Update 1. It's funny how a single cracked window changes the way the whole house feels. Months have folded over since the board removed her name from the org chart, and the noise has dulled into something like memory. But echoes have a way of sticking around. Small, surprising sounds that remind you the world shifted, even if the furniture looks the same. Claire, predictably, didn't disappear. For a while she kept a low profile. Quiet LinkedIn posts about growth and blurred photos of symposiums I didn't remember seeing her at. There were whispered attempts to get a foot in at small firms, an interview here and a consulting pitch there. But reputation is a strange currency. Once it cracks, people count the cost differently. Background checks that used to be perfunctory started to pull threads, and the patterns we'd uncovered at our company followed her like a shadow. A few places invited her for a conversation and then stopped returning calls. That, more than anything, felt like a new kind of consequence. Not vindictive, just practical. Companies don't want liability wrapped in charm. Legally, the process moved at the polite pace of institutions. There were hearings, settlements, and a regulatory review that dragged certain decisions into public filings. Some of Claire's closest enablers negotiated confidential exits with compensation. Others faced harsher scrutiny. The fines and remediations the company accepted were not small, but they weren't theatrical either. The kind of penalties that forced boardrooms to change language and policies and to buy a new kind of caution. For those of us who'd lived through the uncertainty, the fines read like proof that the system sometimes does bite back. On a personal level, the aftershocks were less neat. Some ex-colleagues rebuilt quickly. Marta's consulting contract turned into steady client work. Jeremy's forensic role became a linchpin in IT governance. David didn't rush back into his old rhythm. He took a sabbatical, then a part-time role that let him test the water without being dragged into the undertow of corporate life. He's quieter now, careful with enthusiasm, but clearer about what he wants. I've seen him laugh at a joke without flinching, and that small thing feels like major recompense. Me? I sit on the oversight committee and do the small, necessary work of asking the blunt questions no one wants. It's less glamorous than the headlines, but vital. Quarterly reviews, third-party panels, a few late-night calls about a hiring process that seems too fast. There are nights I'm exhausted, and nights I'm grateful. I didn't do it for applause. I did it because I'd seen what silence did to good people. The public narrative has smoothed into a version that fits tidy columns. Scandal, investigation, consequence. But the messy parts live in private inboxes, in careers rerouted, in people who chose stability over principle and the complicated judgments we make when rent is due. We want a measurable justice, and yet the world asks of us that we keep building. Better checks, kinder processes, firmer guards against charm dressed as competence. If there's a single lesson I keep returning to, it's this: exposing a lie doesn't end the work. It merely changes its shape. And if I'm honest, I wouldn't trade the effort. Not because I like conflict, but because people's lives were worth the trouble it took. Update 2. About a year after the whole thing blew up, an email from an unknown address slid into my inbox. The subject line was so ordinary it felt suspicious. Coffee? It was from one of Claire's old Inner Circle members, someone who'd left just before the investigation began in earnest. He claimed he wanted to clear the air and share his side of the story. I stared at it for a full 5 minutes before closing my laptop. In the past, I might have been curious, maybe even eager to hear his version. But by then I'd learned that motives are rarely as simple as they appear in the subject line of an email. Still, part of me wondered what he thought I didn't already know. I didn't reply right away. I forwarded it to the Oversight Committee chair instead. Her response was immediate and unceremonious. Do not meet without counsel present. That told me enough. These moments, little flares from the past, still arrive unannounced. Someone I barely recognize will connect with me on LinkedIn, only for me to realize they were tangentially involved in those years. At networking events, I'll feel an unexpected pause in conversation when my name registers. People know the story, even if they only know the elevator pitch version of it. I've become a kind of unofficial case study in some circles, the guy who helped take down the toxic HR lead. It's not a label I sought, but I understand why it sticks. The company has moved forward, but the shadow lingers. We have new leadership that actually treats transparency as more than a buzzword. Quarterly governance reports are shared company-wide. Employees have an anonymous channel to flag unethical practices, and they're actually investigated. These are small revolutions, and they came with a cost. I still see Claire's name in passing sometimes. Once, it was in the footer of a business coaching webinar. Another time, in a trade newsletter's People on the Move section, though that appointment vanished in the next issue. It's strange. She's neither fully gone nor fully present. Like a ghost testing the locks on doors she no longer owns the keys to. As for me, the invitations keep coming to speak on panels about ethics, to share my journey in leadership podcasts. I accept some, decline others. The truth is, I don't want to turn the worst chapter of my career into my personal brand. I'd rather let it be a reminder that vigilance is not a posture you hold once, but a habit you cultivate quietly in every meeting, every hire, every decision where comfort tempts you to look away. The past doesn't write your future, but it can leave you with a pen you didn't expect to be holding. And apparently, mine still has ink.